All right. Good morning. Good morning, guys. Or wherever you are. But anyways, good morning from over here. Um, so today, I'm gonna. I'm still debating whether I really want to share this kind of personal aspect of. But I think it's important to share it because it would kind of it probably to give to get at what I want to explain. What I want to explain here. Okay, um, so the topic today is deprivation of experience, right? This is something similar to I was recently watching the talk between Cadell Last and um, what's his name, Peter Rollins. I was recently um, I think it is Peter Rollins, right? Yeah, I was recently watching that talk. Something that Peter Rollins says. He says in the talk with Cadell Last about how he he wants to um, engage with a God that's also castrated. And so just keep that word, a God that is also castrated, and I'm going to sort of tie this in with the topic for today, the deprivation of experience. So something was said to me the other day, um, and it was something that was surprisingly hurtful, right? And when I mean surprisingly, I want you to take this in like the literal sense. It was surprising. I think there's elements, there's things said in our lives that we know it would hurt a person. It would hurt them to hear it. But then there's things said in our lives that are surprisingly hurtful. And so something like that was said to me the other day. And there was a twofold kind of shock to this experience. The reason why there's a twofold shock to this experience was that actually, one, I was surprised that I was hurt by the statement, and then the one who said it was surprised that I was hurt from the statement, right? So that there's twofold. It was a twofold kind of, uh, you know, relation, kind of in that sense, right? And what I've noticed as I get older, one thing that I had to start paying attention to a little bit more was that I noticed that specific words, there's one thing, there is this illusion, and I think it is what I would call terroring with the illusion. And this is the terroring with the illusion is that you have this ideal, right? And I guess in Freudian terms, you could say we have this ego ideal about the way that you perceive yourself, right? And so in that moment, I had perceived myself as a man that doesn't get offended by these words, right? But the way words have a capacity to seep is that words kind of just wash over us. But what's interesting about the way that they sort of wash over us is that they wash over us, but if there's a wound there, they sort of seep in, right? And so in that case, it's very similar to like when you cut yourself, or you didn't know you had a cut in your finger, and then you wash your hands with sanitizer. Then all of a sudden you realize there's a cut there. So it's like this post hoc realization that, oh, there's there's a wound there. I didn't even know there was a wound there. Um, and so yeah, that's essentially what happened to me. There was this wound there. And I realized, and so here's what was said. The debate, it wasn't really a debate, but it was just sort of like a disagreement. The disagreement that hypotheticals in relationships need to be entertained so that way, you know, people kind of like so that way you kind of reveal a sort of full transparency, right? I won't. So, for example, uh, this isn't the best example of full transparency and of when couples entertain hypotheticals, but the full transparency is that at least what was the example that was used in the my situation was, um, the couple that I'm friends with kind of raised the question, okay, if this happened to me, basically it's the logic of the hypothetical. This happened to me, how would you react, right? Would you still believe me, trust me, kind of thing, right? And I said something like that. I said something like, I don't want to entertain those. I don't understand why we have to entertain those hypotheticals, right? Like just sort of, you know, kind of deal with them as they happen, right? And so the comments that were said after that was the surprisingly hurt statement. And so what the statement was after, oh, you don't understand, you don't know because you're not in a relationship. Actually, you've never been in a long-term relationship, so you don't know how it works, right? Now, that statement in itself, right, it shouldn't sound hurtful. It should only be humbling in some kind of way. However, this is where I say it was surprisingly hurtful, right? And so there was this tension within myself of one being ashamed of feeling hurt by that statement, and then also one being amazed that I was hurt by that statement. Um, and so, like I said, it was like a twofold shock where it was the one who said it was shocked that I was hurt that it was said. Me, I was shocked myself that it was hurt that it was said, right? Um, so there is this. I mean, I feel like not many people talk about this particular kind of experience where not even the person expected, like, not even the person expected that that was going to be what was hurtful, kind of thing. Um, and then even the one that said it was like, I didn't expect that that was kind of like touchy, for you. And then it's like this realization that's like, oh, I didn't know it was touchy for me either. It's like kind of like this interesting dynamic. But anyways, yeah. Uh, but I was reflecting on this kind of uh, I was dwelling on this experience last night when I was getting ready for bed, and then I dwelled again on this experience as I was waking up this morning, and then it kind of dawned on me a little bit about how I am not appreciating it. It was this deep irony in all of it that was even said, a deep irony. The deep irony was that even though they were saying, even though the statement said, you don't know because you don't have this experience. That was the hurtful statement, right? That you don't know because you never had this experience, right? And I remember to them and trying to reveal to them why that statement was surprisingly hurtful. And so to kind of give an analogy about how it works, I said, I gave this example to them. I said, imagine two women. Imagine two women. Um, and one woman says to the other woman, you don't know because you don't have children. You don't know this. You don't understand because you don't have children. But what that other woman doesn't understand is that the woman that she said that to has been trying to have children for years. And she just happened to be the one that can't have children. Right. So I kind of gave that sort of analogous uh, statement to reveal how 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 the statement felt when the statement was said to me, "Oh, you don't know because you've never been in a long-term relationship." Now, what's funny about the notion of long-term, right? And this was something that I even had to grapple with my own writing because I've always now I actually see the parallels with my own writing. I always wanted I was always frustrated. I was always like, why can't I write longer pieces? I don't understand. Why can't I write extremely long pieces? Why is it that I write rather short, sort of condensed ideas? And I express them. I feel like at the end I have fully expressed them. I feel if I were to write any more, it would just sort of be superfluous, just sort of be unnecessary. I have already expressed the idea. Um, and so I started realizing that what was hurtful, right, was the deprivation of experience, the reminder that you are barred from knowing something. Even though deep inside I felt a disagreement that what they were talking about when they were saying that, oh, couples need to entertain these hypotheticals because that's how they sort of engage in sort of long-term relationships, right? But what I had said to them in response was that I said no. I was like, the underlying logic of entertaining hypotheticals with couples is that they want to know that they can trust their partner and they want that reaffirmed. But what's ironic about this, and unfortunately I did not say this last piece, um, I said but what's really ironic about entertaining hypotheticals as a couple, right? To feel kind of reconfirmed, to to re-verify that trust, is that ironically you have to already believe, you already have to trust that person, you already have to trust what is being said in the very moment of your reconfirmation of yourself, like your reconfirmation. You actually have to believe it. You actually have to have faith. I don't want to intertwine belief and faith here, but I'll say you actually have to have a kind of faith that what is being said is true in order to um, have that constant, to have that reconfirmation of re-verification. I should say re-verification. That's better. To have that re-verification of trust. Um, so, so yeah, okay. So yeah, I addressed all those things. But now to the deprivation of experience. Um, but what I realized, um, and what I've not really appreciated for years actually, was that I also have a kind of uh, I have something that they are deprived of as well. You know, uh, something that it's an experience that uh, people have. They have that experience, but also they have not. let me put it this way. Not many people accept it with grace. Let me put it, not many people accept it with grace. And what do I mean by accepting it with grace? Um, so for example, the topic was that the topic that was breached was my own my own singleness and their coupleness. Let's put it that way. My singleness and their coupleness, or their togetherness and my singleness. Right. This was the topic that was breached. Okay. Um, so in that very statement that I was deprived of an experience, that there are certain matters I cannot speak of because I am not in a long-term relationship and I don't have the experience to back that up. Um, like I said before, that was, it was surprisingly hurtful for all of us to acknowledge. Um, but I also realized that an experience, right? They are deprived of a long-term, what I would long-term singleness, right? Long-term singleness. And of course, my own area of romantic life is deeply complicated. It's not like a clean and cut dry, like, oh, I just, it's like, oh, I just haven't found people, and or I'm picky or something like that. It's not cut, like my history in that world is not very, it's deeply complicated and complex, and um, it's not something that's just very cut and dry. Um, but as I started dwelling upon this experience, my own experience of being a single man, right? So to speak, um, I realized that actually a lot of people are barred from my own experience of my the way I handle my singleness. What do I mean by this? I'm talking about the people that are single and they sort of mourn over, they're constantly mourning over being single, right? What's ironic about my situation is that my singleness is not something that I put at the center of my attention. It's not something that is at the center of my attention. It's not something that I actively strive to uh, accommodate. I do not actively it. I sort of just accept it as it presents itself. You know what I mean? If there becomes an opportunity, I take it. To whatever. But I do not actively pursue to get rid of my singleness. If and so that's what I mean, that I have years of experience of accepting this singleness with grace. Um, and that is a kind of experience and knowledge that I would say also bars people from having. Uh, but it surprised me, right? What surprised, and this is what was surprising, was that when the statement was said, right, that you don't know because uh, you're not with somebody, you haven't been with somebody for a long term, so there's elements of understanding about relationships that you're just kind of barred from. When that was a statement that was surprisingly hurtful, um, I realized, after kind of reflecting on this experience, I realized that I was not really appreciating. I was not really appreciating it. I was like almost, I think, if I were to reinterpret my experience of this statement, was that I was not appreciating the inner strength and the sort of inner grace uh, that I have done all these years with with my singleness, right? Because I think, like I said before, I think to tarry with your singleness is to essentially not make it and this is ironical, right? Is to not make it the center of your uh, achievements, to not make it the center of your strivings. A lot of people make it the center of their strivings. I cannot handle my singleness. It feels uncomfortable. I cannot breathe in my singleness. It feels too much, right? But and so if I were to again reinterpret the statement, what was it that actually hurt? What was it that actually hurt? Um, what actually hurt? And I'm inverting this experience. I am causing I am trying to do an ironic interpretation of my experience, right? Because again, the initial experience was that something was said, and the statement was, you don't know or you don't understand because you are single. You've never been in these extremely long term relationships. So you don't know how, right? That's the part that was surprisingly hurtful, right? But to give it an ironic interpretation is actually to understand it like this, and this is going to be my interpretation now, is that what hurts really is that I never gave pure acknowledgement or appreciation for my own tearing with my singleness. Like I never appreciated the fact that I accepted all of the circumstances, all the complicated circumstances of my dating history, sort of grace, um, and to sort of understand that, that tearing with a kind of grace, right? And again, what I meant by grace was that I never like I said, it's one of those things that's like most people feel deeply uncomfortable to be single for a long time. A lot of people struggle with that acknowledgement because they're constantly trying to get rid of it, constantly trying to free themselves of that thing, right? But for myself, what's ironic is that really, I never made it the focus of my attention. Let's just put it that way. I never, uh, yeah, it's just something I just never really you know. But again, what was initially hurtful is that I felt attacked from the fact that I was barred from participating in a conversation because I could not relate. I did not have the experience to relate. Um, but whether that's true or not, there's still parts of me that has somewhat disagreements because there is a kind of fundamental underlying. Uh, but anyways, whether it is agreeable or disagreeable or not, um, the hurting, the part that hurts, the ironic interpretation is that I think what actually hurts was that acknowledgement of all those years of tarrying with one's singleness, and also not striving to really get rid of it, sort of facing the uncomfortability, facing the anxiety of not having an intimate other to share with, right? That I feel like now that was a wound that was never embraced in a sense, that was like never appreciated. Like I guess what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we suffer, and when we suffer, we don't appreciate how we suffered, if that makes any sense. We don't admire how we suffered that. And I'm kind of, and I think it was my reading of Viktor Frankl on the meaning on A Man's Search for Meaning, where Viktor Frankl, he does a kind of Kierkegaardian move where he says, sometimes what he goes, sometimes your meaning is that suffering. Sometimes your meaning is that suffering. Sometimes your meaning might be to accept that suffering, to confront that suffering. Um, Sometimes that may be all that it is in that moment. Um, and uh, you know that was yeah. I think that kind of really had a, a mind blowing kind of like realization for myself, really. Like, and I've actually always theoretically believed this, but of course, like we've always talked about, there's always a difference between theory and actually taking that theory and experiencing that theory. But I've always said, in a way, but now I can actually confirm it. I've always believed that, and now I'm blinking out, ironically. Uh, um, yeah, I mean, I wish I could give it to you guys. I'm sorry, but anyways, I always believed that there was something about the experience of that suffering. Um, of course, now that I've lost my words, I can't really. Yeah, it's basically what I've already said. Um, that we don't appreciate that suffering. Um, we become ashamed of, like, that's something that I suffered, and it's weird to explain this, and what I'm trying to explain is that we don't even appreciate the deprivation of the experience. And it's an ironical statement because the deprivation of an experience is an experience of itself, in itself. And most of the time, we, like, for example, if I were to, this is going to be so hard to express, but I think I think I found a way. So the interpretation of experience typically goes like this: if I'm single for a while, there's meaning in being in being single, because I am suffering towards becoming eventually taken, to eventually become taken by the other and have my commitments with the other. And so there is meaning in that singleness, right? That is the conventional approach to um, transitioning from being single, or the meaning of being single, to going into togetherness, right? That is the typical approach, right? And of course, some people kind of handle it more poorly than others because they want to get rid of it instantly, but you know, and so on. But what I'm trying to say is that that is not always the meaning of tarrowing with your singleness. That is not always the meaning. That is not always the of that goal. And it goes with the same kind of logic of a woman that always wanted a child but cannot have a child. It's this, and and of course the circumstances between a single person and wanting to be in a relationship with people, and then the woman that struggles to have a child, Of course, it's not equivocal. It's not equivocal in any way, but it is, there is an underlying logic kind of the same. And that underlying logic is that the woman looks at her meaning a woman as being a mother, right? And so she feels like her sufferings for not having a child should be justified in some way, in some way. In the same way that a single person, when they struggle with their singleness, that their sufferings, their lack of connection, their lack of emotional affection between another being, they feel like their sufferings should be justified in some important way. But what I am trying is that the irony is that they are justified in and of themselves. It it does have to do with a kind of directionality about where you are aiming that experience of suffering towards. Now, I know Viktor Frankl, um, he plays off the fact that the what he calls the will to meaning is supposed to be something that the person finds a kind of like future element. But there's also, and Viktor Frankl says this too, he says there's also the inverse way where you look at the past of yourself, because that past of yourself is not lost. Also look at it in terms of like a sort of a rich a rich storage, right? A rich storage of things. And so the mother, like the mother who struggles to have a child, or the person that struggles with their singleness and cannot, and and just at the context of the time cannot afford to have the longing, the belongingness of another person. um, what there is a sort of there is an appreciation of that experience. There is a kind of, as Viktor Frankl would say, there is a sort of meaning to that suffering. There is a meaning to that suffering. And sometimes that meaning is not, like Viktor Frankl says, the meaning of life is not a general, vague kind of statement. It goes from moment to moment, and it's something that you have to pay attention to, because from moment to moment, there's always things that demand to be fulfilled. But in this case, and in this scenario, what what needs to be fulfilled is a simple act of appreciation, really, of, of kind of like not shamefulness, not being ashamed, not feeling ashamed, because feeling ashamed implies a kind of lack, right? It implies that you you failed to achieve something, right? But you failed to achieve something not out of willingness. You failed to achieve something out of mere coincidental, and maybe even perhaps inescapable conditions, like the mother that cannot have a child. Um, and so basically, what is happening in this conversation of experiences about, we're talking about where to place the lack. It's not that the lack doesn't exist. It's about a question of where do I place the lack? And I think if you were to really understand Viktor Frankl's will to meaning, it is exactly that. Where do you place the lack? Because I feel like actually most people place lack in the wrong way. They don't. know where to place it. And like myself, most times you don't know how to place it because the immediate impression, the immediate confrontation, the immediate and, hermeneutical understanding of that experience, uh, I'm lacking. But there's a way to inverse that understanding and to say the world is lacking. Uh, you're not lacking. And so back to my experience of tarrying with my singleness, right? To understand is actually, even though I'm single, right? There's a kind of apparent lack. I don't have somebody. Uh, but the actual the way to interpret that lack is to understand that actually most people, and this is going to be the lack, most people don't know how to tarry with their singleness. That is the lack. That is the lack that you can find meaning in. That is a lack that you can understand. You're kind of like suffering in some type of way. That these people they they don't know because they've never tarried with that. So I'm inversing the argument that was proposed to me, that that was surprisingly hurtful. Like I said before, that was only surprisingly hurtful because now that I reflect upon that experience, I feel like I've never appreciated the fact. I've never really gave credence or attention to the fact that I've tarried with my singleness. I've never really appreciated that. And I never really appreciated that I was the one that I never tried to get rid of it. It was not an occupation of my mind. You know, I mean, I'm not going to lie to you and say that there aren't glimmers of moments that you long for another human being. That's perfectly natural. But it's the fact that it was just it was something that it's not something I ever gave my full attention to. The fact that I've tarried with it, and I still continue to tarry with it. But I like to say that I tarry with it with grace because it is never really the occupation of my mind. It is something that when you get so involved with your own thought and thinking, it's sometimes that there's sometimes you encounter a sort of a super awareness. You go, oh, I'm alone. There's those occasional moments that occur, but again, I think the people that make that the focus of their experience, meaning the very focus to get rid of it, all they see is that they are alone. Um, and so what I am saying is that it is a problem with the locality of lack. There is a lack. It is apparent that there's lack. Um, but I do like the fact that actually the tearing of my own singleness is the lack that people don't like. Not many people grapple it well. you know, it's funny because a lot of like I remember I would hear the statement. The logic is that you really want to get rid of it as fast as you can, right? It's like a disease kind of like thing. Like, oh, you snap, I'm single, try to get rid of it. But then there's also that logic of singleness and popular culture where it's like, oh, I'm so proud, but really that proudness of being single is a sort of coping mechanism to help them grapple with being single and so on. But it is really like a false comfort. They're still actually, what's ironic about that statement is they're still centering themselves in that very singleness by the very fact that they're talking about it, right? And as you know, this is actually the first time of me actually talking about this kind of like openly, right? my my singleness and my terroring with my singleness, um, and so on. Right? It's never really like a topic of conversation for me, because, like I said before, it's not something that I focus on. Um, but I also realize that it's also something that I need to appreciate. You know, because then you come across surprising words and statements that hurt you. But again, after reinterpreting that experience, right? Because the initial impression was like, oh, I'm hurt because they just attacked me for my own singleness, right? They said that I don't know because I don't have not been in a relationship for a long time. So how would I know? Um, there's a way to, like I said, there's a way to invert that interpretation into acknowledging that they also don't know, right? They also don't know how it feels to really tarry with what you've tarried with. You know what I mean? And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that we often don't acknowledge what we would call like a twofold lack. You know, that yes, I lack something, but you also lack something. And I think I think that is probably a lot of the breach for um, misunderstandings and even envy, jealousy, resentment, is that we often don't see how the other also lacks. Um, and so this goes back to what Peter Rollins, and remember when I said this in the beginning, it's taken me 40 minutes to get to this final conclusion. Um, remember, and when I said in the beginning, I was watching the talk between Cadell Last and Peter Rollins, and Peter Rollins said something about how he wanted a God that is also castrated. And so this is what I mean, is that the very appreciation of my suffering was also acknowledging that, one, it was acknowledging the sort of grace that I never made it a center of my sort of like achievements or a center of like my attention, that I've always sort of accepted it with grace and tarried it with grace. But there was also the idea that people also, like the people that are couples, right? They probably have never also tarried with a long-term singleness that, that they didn't try to intentionally get rid of. You know what I mean? They didn't try to, that, it was an assumption of their mind. Because I would probably say most people, especially in our contemporary society today, most people make it the center of their attention. You know, they make it the center of their attention about being single or about being taken, right? And even the very idea, and this can also cause for cyclical kind of experiences where, they go from being taken to single, being taken to single, and so on. Because, one, people, what ends up happening if you never really tarry with your singleness is that people end up being scared to lose another human being, right? They get scared to deal with that because really they never dealt with it because they always tried to get rid of it. Um, but yes, so what I'm trying to say is that when you find the castration in the other, it gives an ironic meaning. It gives you an ironic meaning that even though I am also castrated, right? I'm just sort of using these sort of psychoanalytic terms. Uh, they are also castrated. They are also castrated. Except I am castrated in a specific way, and they're castrated in a specific way, but they're also castrated. And so I guess, if we were to approach lack in a sort of sincere way, I think it would begin with acknowledging that the other is also castrated. And this is why I went back. This is why I talked about, this is why I really liked Peter Rollins' statement that, you know, we need to realize that when he was talking about religion with Cadell, we need to also realize that God is also castrated. God is also castrated. And there's a it's funny because there's a kind of comfort in that. There's a comfort in realizing that the other is castrated. And it may not be the same way that you're castrated, but it is in the same way in that sense. But I think this acknowledgement that the other is also castrated, it it gives an irony of meaning that your suffering in and of itself has a kind of admiration to it, that the other, or has a kind of strength to it that the other cannot experience, and also vice versa. It's vice versa. But the thing is, see, most of us can only grapple with suffering if we sort of try. We can achieve that goal, right? That my suffering is only purposeful if I can eventually become taken and have a relationship. But like the example that I like to use with the woman that can't have a child is not guaranteed that you will. It's not guaranteed. And so then how do you make, and I don't like this word, make sense of your suffering, because in many ways it's the suffering itself, like Viktor Frankl says, that is the meaning. That is the meaning that needs to be fulfilled sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes. But I think in this scenario, that is actually the case, right? That the suffering demands to be. It's not that you find. It's not that you find a reason to kind of like, how can I explain this? You don't try to make sense of it in such a way like that, but you fulfill it by facing it. If that makes any sense, you fulfill it by facing it. You don't fulfill it by trying to achieve that maybe impossible goal, right? If you can't, for example, if you can't have children and you've tried everything, right? That is a barred goal. You cannot have children. Like, that is a bar. You cannot. So how do you deal with that suffering then, right? Um, how do you deal with that lack? And like I said before, the way to interpret that lack is to understand that the other is also castrated. But but the main point is not to focus on how the other is castrated, but to appreciate, how you've tarried with those conditions, how you've faced those conditions, right? Because to be honest, even though, right, even though you're priding, also a kind of, um, it's also kind of a difficult, it's also a kind of difficult to experience, or for other people. Most people don't have the experience of not having a child, not struggling to have a child. Maybe not a lot of people have that experience, right? So it's not necessarily focusing on that castration of the other, but understanding that by looking at the castration of the other, you can appreciate your own tearing, right? Your own inner strength with that kind of confrontation with suffering, because that confrontation in itself is unique, right? That's this sort of unique confrontation that not many people have, right? Not many statistics, but I'm just assuming here, if you grant me this assumption, right? I'm assuming that, I mean, yes, there's people that sort of suffer it, but what I'm trying to get at is, if I were to give a more specific example, is that even with all the techniques for, having a child and so on, there are some women that even could not have that in vitro fertilization and IVF. They could not have the IVF, right? Or that didn't work, or they couldn't successfully adopt, and all these other things, right? Um, because maybe they're single, I forget I don't know all the adoption rules, but it's not easy. I know adoption is not an easy process either. So, um, you know, that itself is a sort of unique experience and a sort of unique suffering that not meant to experience and have to tarry with. But what I'm trying to get at is, and I think Viktor Frankl is trying to get at, is you do yourself a kind of injustice to your suffering. And I think this is the main point of what I'm trying to say, that you do yourself an injustice to your suffering by focusing on that lack of of what you cannot reach or have. But you can do a kind of justice to your suffering by acknowledging how the other is castrated, um, how the other does not have that you have. And so it gives you a kind of, I don't want to say pride, but it gives you a sense of um, appreciation, a sort of like admiration about your suffering, a sort of willingness that's like, yes, I said yes to this suffering, that I said yes to the suffering. And I think this is probably the most Nietzschean part that I'm getting at, is that I said yes to my suffering. And what I'm trying to say is that if you also acknowledge how the other is castrating, that's a way for you to say yes to your suffering. That's like, yes, I can't have children. Like, yes, I cannot. Yes, I am single. That is true. Yes, that is true. Right? That I said yes to it. Right? I'm not guilty. I'm not ashamed over the fact that I cannot have what you have. Right? But I said yes to my unique situation, my suffering of that situation. And so, yeah, so to end it all with that is to say that the deprivation of an experience is also an experience that the other lacks, that the other lacks also. And I think, and I guess this is why I've had uh, problems with understanding lack in a real way, because people, um, it's like they acknowledge lack, but they don't acknowledge lack in a sense of how the other lacks too. Like they seem to look at lack like it's unidirectional, like it's only one way, right? I'm missing something, he has everything. Um, but if you interpret it like the other is missing something too, right? The other also lacks, also castrated. Um, yeah, that kind of changes the whole relating, and that changes the whole experience of um, what is being said. You know, and it's funny because sometimes the people that even say those things to you, like they say like, oh, you don't know because you're single, you haven't been in a long-term relationship for a long time, right? um, some of those things that people can say, is that what's ironic about that statement is that sometimes those are the very same people that would basically commit suicide the moment the other dissipates, right? The other sort of misses, right? And so, and actually, Viktor Frankl sort of uses this example. He uses this example of a man that sort of lost his wife or something, and he sort of inverts. Wouldn't it be more troublesome if it was you that died and then your wife had to deal with the burden of you dying, right? And the guy acknowledged, he said, "Oh, yeah, it would have been, I think my wife would have handled it even worse." And so Viktor Frankl says, wouldn't it do kind of justice that you accept the suffering, you bear the suffering, instead of getting rid of it by suicide? And that sort of actually motivated the man to actually bear and confront that suffering. That sort of gave him this. Um, he like if it was a gift, like if it was a gift to bear it. But yeah, anyways, I hope you guys hope you guys somewhat appreciated that. But yeah, I have to go. All right, so you guys take care. Bye.